This lecture is our final on ancient Greece, where we find that after the death of Alexander the Great, Greek culture will be spread throughout the known world, all the way up until India, spreading from Western Europe, Egypt, all the way across the Middle East. And this is when we find Hellenism, or Greek culture, dominating these various areas. The Hellenistic period will last from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE until the fall of ancient Egypt to Rome in 32 BCE with Cleopatra. Returning from his conquests all the way to India, we find that Alexander the Great mysteriously falls ill, possibly being poisoned by one of his generals, returning to Greece. While on his deathbed, the generals asked him, "To whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander the Great famously stated, "To the strongest." Hence, the great empire will become divided among his most ambitious generals, for none of them would cede that they were not the strongest. We have a civil war that follows. This leads to the Hellenistic period, where we find the spread of Hellenism is going to be made possible thanks to the conquests of Alexander the Great, and all of these areas now being under Greek dominion. There is no administrative structure that Alexander left behind in his short time, nor did he name a successor, and so each one of these areas will be ruled by a general. With Alexander's death, his generals turned on each other. They are going to find resistance from local leaders who, hearing upon his death, try to regain their autonomy, leading to 2 decades of warfare between them, that being those that once held power in these regions conquered by Alexander and his own generals. In the early 3rd century BCE, we find that 3 generals come out on top and carve out their own kingdoms. Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus are all going to be those that establish these great kingdoms. This is the age of monarchies, for we return to the notion of kingship as opposed to democracy, which was doomed to fail in this multi-ethnic, multicultural area. There were too many types of people and of perspectives, religions, and cultures. Therefore, it must be more autocratic in order to rule. So the Hellenistic world is divided up between the Antigonids that are going to control Macedonia and mainland Greece that we'll discuss. The Seleucids are going to control Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and Persia, whereas the Ptolemies are going to control Egypt. Each one of these will leave a lasting impact on the area once conquered by Alexander the Great. The Romans are going to slowly chip away at this kingdom that is set up after Alexander's death, from the 2nd century to the 1st century, until they all succumb to Rome. Now, in the Hellenistic world, the Ptolemaic section or kingdom lasts the longest, the capital being set up at Alexandria, named for Alexander the Great himself. Here we have a seaport and a center of learning and of the arts that's going to house the most important library and one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world as well. This library holds 700,000 papyrus and parchment scrolls, and they had the unenviable task of copying every text in existence. So every ship which docked at their harbor had to surrender any writing that they had so it could be copied and become part of the library, which was all-encompassing in its knowledge. Here we would have seen the most impressive collection of knowledge in all of antiquity that was sadly lost in a fire, setting us back millennia. Now, at Alexandria, we find one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world existing. These, of course, include the pyramids of Giza, the only one still in existence. But the lighthouse of Alexandria was also here and was quite impressive and noted by those who visited. Here is a scale model of the lighthouse, of which, of course, we would have had a rotating mirror to ensure that the light could be seen from 360 degrees all the way up. Now, in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Rome defeated the Ptolemies and took over ancient Egypt. It would be Cleopatra VII, who lived between 69 and 30 BCE, who would bequeath the area of Egypt that her ancestors controlled to Rome. And we find that since the Greeks refused to learn Egyptian, we have documents written in both, hence the Rosetta Stone would be there to assist Egyptian scribes in translating ancient Greek to Egyptian and vice versa. We know that at her death and suicide by asp, Egypt becomes part of Rome as well, hence the Ptolemaic dynasty. Now, Alexander's legacy is going to be to spread Greek culture throughout the known world, all the way in the Middle East into India. But art, we find here, developed further away from this generalized ideal that is going to be heroic and serene, and instead more towards what we looked at last time, and that is something that is dramatic and theatrical, connecting with various multi-ethnic populations. This is a move towards a focus on the individual instead of a democratic understanding of the city-state. So the mortal and emotional melodrama will be increased as far as the focus is concerned. This type of art appeals to the senses and not to the mind like in the high classical era. And this includes both how we understand architecture and sculpture. So be sure to watch Engineering an Empire, especially the section between 18 and 27 minutes that will elaborate on Hellenistic architecture at this time. The changes in architecture can be seen in Epidaurus and the existing Tholos temples at Delphi, where we find Greek theaters are going to develop, where plays would be performed during sacred festivals. And it is important to note that theatrical performances originally were not for entertainment only, but instead were religious rituals, especially to the god Dionysus. We find here at Epidaurus in Greece, Polyclitus the Younger, who could have been the nephew of the high classical sculptor Polyclitus the Elder, is going to make one of these very famed and intact theaters built on a hillside, as are all Greek theaters, using the natural landscape to their benefit. Now we find that theaters are broken up into different sections, that being the place where the audience sits and where people perform. Now where the audience is going to be seated, which is called by the Greeks a theatron, where we get our term for theater to begin with, is going to be translated into English as a place for seeing and overlooks the orchestra, or orchestra as we now understand it, which is the dancing place. This is where we have an area set aside for rites, songs, and dances, and is the precursor to where the modern day stage would be on theaters for plays and other performances. So in the center of the orchestra, we would have originally had an altar to Dionysus. Now, the dancing and performance for Dionysus is not unusual. We find that it is celebrated throughout Greece on vase painting and on many artworks. For the cult of Dionysus, which his followers were all female or Maenads, would gather together. They would play music and dance. They would drink until they were drunk and eat raw meat. But the celebration of Dionysus ensures fertility for all of those involved, for he is the god that controls the liquid and substances, especially relating to reproduction. So here we have a massive theater, 387 feet in diameter, with 55 rows that could accommodate 12,000 spectators. Now, what is interesting about the theater and how it was designed by the Greeks in this hemispherical design is that it had excellent acoustics and an unobstructed view anywhere one sat down to the orchestra can be seen even today. And even today, you can speak at a normal volume while in the orchestra, and it can be heard very clearly at the back of this auditorium, 55 rows back, in fact. So 500 yards away here, we also have a sanctuary of Asclepius that Polyclitus the Younger designed in a tholos, or circular shrine. It is now destroyed, but these circular temples became very popular in this period.
Here we have Theodorus of Phocaea in the Tholos temple at Delphi, and here we have an example of what the circular, or tholos, which is the circular word for circular in ancient Greek, would be, and how it would have appeared. Now, the orders of Greek architecture develop, as we see here, in order from the Doric, which is the serious, severe order that is developed first. This Doric order would be used for temples as early as the Archaic era and is designed on the innovations that the Egyptians had successfully accomplished and communicated to their northern counterparts. The Ionic order, named for Asia Minor or Ionia, an area where the Greeks controlled on the mainland in modern-day Turkey, is going to have the spiraling volutes at the capital and was often fluted. The final order is the Corinthian, which would be invented in the late 400s, but not come into widespread use on the exterior of buildings really until the Roman period. Here we find that the exterior colonnade is Doric, which is going to develop again in the late classical era and is going to be used quite heavily in the Hellenistic examples that we're looking at. But the interior here, interestingly enough, is going to be Corinthian, generally reserved for goddesses. And so we find these circular temples, as with the Aphrodite of Knidos, have a feminine association with them. So the Corinthian order here, as can be seen with these acanthus leaves and coiled flower spikes, are going to surround this basket-shaped core. So the decorative elements would be seen as the most feminine, whereas the Doric the most masculine. This invention in the mid-4th century is going to be carried on by the Romans and even named Corinthian order by the Romans after Corinth. So this was not used on the exteriors of these structures until we get to the 2nd century BCE, or roughly around the time the Romans begin conquering mainland Greece. Now, the Hellenistic world is going to include the Antigonid series of structures, especially the ones they devised and built in Athens to compete with the great Parthenon. Now, Cassius is going to be a Roman architect who is going to be responsible for the temple of the Olympian Zeus, which, as just mentioned, was begun after 175 BCE. Hence, we have the 2nd century BCE and a temple that utilizes Corinthian capitals on the exterior. It was at the foot of the Acropolis when completed, a massive standard peripteral temple plan, but much more on the scale of Hellenistic structures than on classical. The foundations, just like the Parthenon, are going to be built on an earlier Doric temple that had been torn down. So we find that we're merely expanding on what had been produced before. Now, the 4 sides of columns with the rectangular structure surrounded by a screen of columns and a 3-stepped base are going to be a bit larger than that of what Ichthyonos and Callicrates had designed for the Parthenon. It is, interestingly enough, a comment on the Parthenon, which is right above it and would be compared to it, because they are both octastyle temples. That means you have 8 columns on the front end, or the short side. The ratios are a bit different, for unlike the Parthenon, which had an 8:17 or 4:9 ratio, the temple of the Olympian Zeus is an 8:20 or a 2:5 ratio. The Corinthian order here used all around the exterior, and, not surprisingly, this is by a Roman architect, and the Corinthian order is named by Romans once again. So it is a highly decorative system that was previously reserved for interiors, but the Romans prefer it to be used on all public monuments and on these decorative flourishes. So this dwarfs the original classical temples like the Parthenon, which was massive for its time. It is twice as big, with the Parthenon having 34-foot high columns, the Temple of Zeus instead with 55-foot high columns. Therefore, it is very Hellenistic and helps us understand this new era, which seeks to impress not by way of relatable scale, but instead by emotional overwhelming of one spectator, not by mathematical harmony, not by this intellectual measure, but is going to be this theatrical presentation which communicates that it is so much more grand than anything we can imagine. And appropriate, we find here that it will be completed under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who would also be responsible for structures like the Pantheon and Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain. So much like the weary Heracles, we have this new understanding, not relating by way of an individual or by an intellectual way, but instead to showcase how incredibly insignificant and puny we are in the face of these massive godlike entities. Now, turning to sculpture, we have two trends that, interestingly enough, move in one of two directions. Either they seek to emulate earlier classical models, as we will discuss next time, or they abandon classical strictures altogether and develop new forms and subjects that are specifically anti-classical. So they're either going to fall in line with and adopt the principles such as the classical dying warrior, or reject them outright for something that is distinctly emotional.
These become court cities from Antioch, Syria, Alexandria. We find Egypt is going to be the capital, and then they will break up these different regions, so ruling in Greece, Asia Minor, Persia, Egypt, in this vast empire. The further away from the Greek strongholds in the West, the more anti-classical these styles become, emphasizing even further that appeal to the emotions that we saw in the evocative, sensuous works of the late classical era. At Pergamon, here we have in Turkey, which was Asia Minor at the time, we have a standard Greek city that will be built on a hillside, using the natural inclination of the topography to their benefit, including, as you see here, a Greek theater. At the time, when completed, we would have had all of the necessary structures for a Greek city, including regular straight grid-like roads, an agora, a temple, an acropolis, a library, and of course a theater. Now, because we now have this very multicultural approach to designing and understanding the city at this time, we find that we're moving or transitioning away from this group mentality of a city-state where we first and foremost would identify ourselves as Spartan, as Corinthian, as Athenian. Now we have numerous individuals from different backgrounds, religions, creeds, customs, and so we identify more as an individual living in a city instead of as a unit. Now, this identification of individuals is going to be important for the styles that will be developed to communicate to them. And as we discussed last time, the easiest way to communicate across a vast array of different backgrounds and people of different belief systems is through an emotional appeal. In Pergamon, we find a city ruled by the Attalid kings, Attalus the First, Second, and Third, and they will monumentalize their victories that made this city possible in sculptures, both in the great altar of Zeus we will discuss here, this hypaethral open sky altar, and then the Gaul group in front of the library. King Attalus I is the founder of this dynasty, who will have monuments erected to him by his later successors, celebrating the victories of the Pergameans over the Gauls, this Celtic people that would be moved to modern-day France when the Romans would encounter them, Julius Caesar throwing them out and into the UK and finally to Ireland. Now, these monuments extol the dignity and heroism of the defeated enemies. Thus, of course, we find we are reinforcing the power and virtue of the Pergameans. In other words, showing how heroic and strong one's enemy is only further supports the argument that you must have been greater because you defeated them. Now the Gauls are going to be pushed through Thrace, then, of course, all the way to France, where Julius Caesar finally pushes them to Ireland. Here we find this fearsome group of warriors that would go into battle nude screaming, and the Gaelic chieftain killing himself and his wife, which of course at the time for the Romans was seen as a very brave and heroic act on the part of the Gauls. Pliny, the Roman historian, will tell us that Epigonos created this group that included a chieftain, a trumpeter, and an Attalid hero who would be battling them. The Gauls are going to be easily identifiable because also, like the Romans after them, the Hellenistic artists are going to appreciate ethnic specificity. So we find that the Gauls have very distinctive features with long hair, mustaches, and torques. Torques will be the neckbands that the greatest warriors and aristocrats of their civilizations wear. Here we have the Tibician, or the trumpeter, whereby the dying Gaul, as it is often nicknamed, is going to show one of these defeated barbarians who has been stabbed in the right side and is laying dying on the ground, buckling under the weight of his own body as he takes his last breaths. The lime-spiked hair and mustache, as well as the twisted neck ring, are going to relate that he is non-Greek. Obviously, he is among the barbarian warriors that the early Pergamians are going to have fought and that they succeeded in defeating. We can tell that he is a trumpeter because the trumpet lies between his legs at the base of the statue. A sword has been dropped next to his hand. Now, the statue implies an unseen Attalid and or an early Pergamian warrior standing over this defeated foe, for someone had to have stabbed him in the side. So we can stand in over this figure, looking down on him in the place of one of our ancestors, an early victorious Attalid. Therefore, we are interacting in a very pathetic and emotional way with this barbarian, whom we can feel superior to, yet we can empathize with. For we cause the pain and suffering he is going through in his final moments, as the lights dim, as his arm buckles, as he prepares for death. Looking at his eyes, we find that they begin to fade, that they are vacant. We find that his body can barely hold itself up, his right arm and bicep quivering under the weight. We feel once again for this dying warrior. We once again do not see a hero, but instead now see an anti-hero, which inspires admiration and piety, or pathos, an emotional response here. So unlike the earlier statues this is based on, for Pliny tells us Epigonos knew the temple of Aphaia at Aegina, that we find the hero here that is shown to be a Greek that we would originally empathize with and sympathize with because we are Greek and look at our fallen comrades, our heroes that came before us. Now we are asked to sympathize with the enemy that we have caused the suffering of. Now, seen in a monumental bronze work together, we would walk around as a living Pergamian, experiencing the glory of our ancestors in a very dramatic and interactive way. Here we find that the Gaelic chieftain has already cut his wife's throat to spare her the indignity of being taken captive, being raped and sold into slavery, and also from being tortured himself as he plunges the short sword into his clavicle as he's going to bleed out here shortly, defying the early Pergamians and showing us how great the Attalids must have been to have defeated such a foe. Here is another possible recreation of the various dying warriors around them and how we can appreciate that they died with dignity. They died well, as the Romans would say. So the Hellenistic Baroque, as we understand it, can be defined by these theatrical gestures, an emotive pathos, and an interest in drama, drawing us into this very emotional presentation of these figures, not heroically successful and triumphant, but these are the losers. We're focusing on, and all of our attention on those that are anti-heroic. To the south, we have another monument that relates to the Pergamean victory over the Gauls, and that is the altar of Zeus, the main temple in the city dedicated to the worship of the king of the gods. A hypaethral or open-air temple that is Ionic order in nature and is decorated with dozens of over life-size sculptures. The Ottoman Turks, who are Muslim importantly, who did not have the Greeks as an ancestor, had no problem allowing the Germans to excavate this monument and move it to Germany in 1879. The monumental staircase, which is 68 feet wide and 30 feet deep, is going to be the backdrop and the setting for this great battle that it illustrates. We have a 7-foot-high sculpted frieze that is approximately 400 feet long, with 100 over life-size figures, illustrating a gigantomachy, or a battle with the giants that we have talked about before. Now, the gigantomachy, which pits the Olympians against the giants, is going to be seen here iconographically relating the Pergamean victory over the Gauls, just as the Athenians had announced their victory over the Persians in the scenes and symbolism in the Parthenon and its decorative elements. Here we find an example with the goddess of war herself, Athena, battling Alkienos, who is going to be a son of Gaia, who can be seen below, pleading for her son's life as Athena grabs him by the hair with her right hand. The giant's right hand also desperately clinging to her forearm, asking to be let free, as we identify him as a giant because his legs turn into serpents below. His wings show us he is a horrible chimerical creature born from the earth. As Athena with her shield is going to be crowned by the goddess Nike, for she will be victorious in this battle. Now, in the iconography, we have a very familiar scene that goes back to the archaic era, as the Olympians battle these giants that are going to be given life by Gaia, Mother Earth, as she turns on the Olympians. However, the presentation is very anti-classical. The figures are going to battle, projecting in high relief, casting very deep shadows, effectively suggesting the very dramatic and theatrical presentation for this very violent action that is occurring here as these figures battle to the death. The figure of Athena is actually modeled on those taken from the Parthenon. And in fact, the artists would have been familiar with the Parthenon because not only does the iconography relate to the Parthenon, but the exact figures do as well. Now, if we look to the ground plane or the organization for the scene, we find that they are entirely lacking in traditional terms, for we do not have a line on which the figures stand. They float, hovering in space, balanced around different chiasmic compositional elements or X-shapes, back and forth, collapsing and cascading diagonals one after another, balancing these forms all the way around this 400-foot frieze. The horizontal and vertical equilibrium that generally is going to accompany such scenes on temples is abandoned here. We find that the balance is only going to be made by opposing diagonals. There is no sky, there is no ground, there is no traditional overlapping even in this instance. Figures are going to be flying dramatically and foreshortened in and out of space in this cosmic battle. Now we're using the chiasmic or X-shaped compositional device that goes back to the archaic era in vase painting, but now for a new, emotional, and dramatically impactful scene. The high relief used here is ideal for figures because it is deeply undercut, and so they come out into our space, almost in the round, as the Olympians are going to drag these giants who defied the Olympians in front of Zeus, the king of the gods, who leads this attack, who is their general, and who will punish them shortly. So we, walking up in between these massive figures, should too cower in front of mighty Zeus and fear his wrath. This being shown, of course, in very dramatic and visceral terms, as figures are going to be beat down, are submissive in front of the king of the gods, and their distortive qualities and snake-like serpentine forms show just how treacherous they are.
In summary, classical art is going to communicate by way of intellectual engagement, making us think about the mathematical harmony of something, the heroic ability of someone to accomplish great feats, but they are not yet. Whereas Hellenistic art is emotional and engages us by way of soliciting empathy from the viewer. We feel for these characters, especially if we are somehow drawn into the dramatic presentation and theatrical presentation here. We are going to not think about, but instead engage with them. Next class, we will continue with the Hellenistic period and the Roman occupation, which further develops along the lines of either the anti-classical route or by emulating classical models, such as in the Venus de Milo.